From today until the 30th of October, SABC News will be running a special focus, Know Your Budget, ahead of the midterm budget later this week. Today, we are focusing on contingency reserves. Before we speak to our guests, let's hear how some economist students explain the word.
Contingency reserve. A contingency reserve is extra money that the government sets aside from their national budget to cater for unforeseen circumstances. For example, this could be for emergency spending when there is an emergency such as a flood, maybe in Durban or in the KZN, and that is the money the government uses so that they do not affect the overall budget they have set for the fiscal year.
Contingency reserve is money that is set aside by government to be used in times of emergencies or in times of crises, such as natural disasters.
So basically, this is a pool of money that is set aside for unexpected expenses or emergencies, right? So the government does this to ensure financial stability within the economy and to also manage risks. This includes examples of like national disasters, floods as you've seen on the news, and also unexpected changes in policy, right? So in our South African context, the National Treasury manages this. So they'll allocate 5 to 10% of the budget that will go towards the contingency reserve, and this is reviewed and adjusted yearly. This money is untouched up until such an unexpected situation occurs.
For more on this, we're now joined by Jannie Rossouw, a professor at the Wits Business School, to help us understand and contextualize the meaning of contingency reserve in relation to our national budget. Prof, when the Minister of Finance addresses us on Wednesday, he'll give us adjusted projections of the fiscal positions, particularly the fiscal deficit that we're faced with. And of course, along that comes other fiscal commitments that they would have made as the government in the February speech and in the State of the Nation address that preceded that. And some of those things we may see a shortfall in, or we may see a surplus in. And all while that is happening, one asks the question, what is the effect of the fiscal deficit and what relationship does it have with a contingency reserve should we run into some trouble?
Good afternoon and good afternoon to the viewers. Yes, indeed, Wednesday we will see the Minister delivering the MTBPS in Parliament. The MTBPS is a midterm assessment of the South African fiscal position. The main budget is in February for the period 1 April to 31 March. And in this assessment, the Minister will give an overview of how revenue is performing, how expenditure is performing, and whether any adjustments in expenditure projections are necessary. Tax changes are typically done in the February budget and not in the MTBPS. So we will have to wait until February next year to see whether the Minister announces any tax changes to deal with the ever-growing demands on government expenditure.
Let's talk about contingency instruments, specifically the contingency reserve in the national fiscus. There are various contingency instruments that we have throughout our fiscal and monetary policy institutions and levers. But let's talk about the National Treasury Contingency Reserve. Is it well capacitated and is it fit for purpose, or do we rely on it way too much lately?
Well, there is every year contingency reserve announced in the budget. When I last looked, it was about 10 billion rands. This is announced by the Minister every year in February, and it is used to defray unplanned or unexpected expenditure, as the students explained in the insert just before this interview. So the government makes provision for unexpected expenses. For instance, a flood, as the one student mentioned. In my view, this is very prudent budgeting. Like in any household, there can be unexpected or unplanned or unbudgeted expenditure. By having a contingency reserve for that purpose from your annual income is very sound budgeting, is a very sound budgeting principle.
Yep. Let's talk about a different contingency reserve, and that is the Gold and Foreign Exchange Contingency Reserve account. This is an account which, in a settlement announced by the Reserve Bank and the National Treasury, we now have a sense of how the money is allocated and what the use for this money will be. It seems to be effectively a drawdown facility of sorts for the National Treasury should it run into very extreme fiscal difficulties. We haven't withdrawn from this much and haven't made use of it much in the past. Are we at a place of a fiscal implosion to the point where we might have to consider withdrawing from the Jafekra account?
The Jafekra account is an account in the South African Reserve Bank. And capital gains and losses on South Africa's gold and foreign exchange reserves are booked to this account. About 20 years ago, there was a very large deficit on the account. And at that stage, the Treasury had to pay money over to the Reserve Bank to settle the Jafekra account. In the meantime, over the past 20 years, there was a surplus in the Jafekra account, mainly as a result of a decline in the exchange rate of the rand. So the minister then announced in February how a part of that surplus will be used. At the time, if I remember well, the Jafekra account was about 500 billion rands. I checked just before this interview. At the moment, it's down to 273 billion rands. And if the rand appreciates any more from its current level, there's a possibility that the balance on that account will get much smaller, because an appreciation in the value of the rand will result in a devaluation in our gold and foreign exchange reserves, and that loss will be booked to the Jafekra account. So it's necessary to keep a balance on that account at all times, should there be a currency appreciation, which of course is good for containing inflation. There must be a reserve in that account that can absorb such a currency appreciation. So it's not as if there's a pool of money that the government can draw at will at any particular point in time. The balance on that account moves as the exchange rate moves and as the gold price moves.
Yeah. And that seems to be one of those contingency that National Treasury will rely on when the rand is really at its weakest, which means that the account, which is denominated in dollar terms, is at its strongest. Do we withdraw from the account, in 30 seconds, Prof, for the right reasons, as announced by National Treasury in February this year?
Well, if there's a surplus, it's the Treasury's money, and the Treasury can withdraw on condition that if there's a deficit on that account, the Treasury and the South African taxpayers must then top up that deficit. We can't run a deficit on that account indefinitely.
Yeah. Prof Rossouw, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Prof Jannie Rossouw is with the Wits Business School.